Hello and welcome to a Streaming Parson Halloween Special podcast, because I don't do those in like ever. And today we are doing a special D4DJ presentation on Lumina, the Mask of Trauma. So I made this, I'm doing this because I'm just trying to get more D4DJ content on the channel, because I know like the last 6 weeks I basically had nothing. I did release that Yuka video yesterday. Definitely check that out after the stream. But because I didn't have anything, I was like, oh man, like I'd fallen behind on creating content. So after I made that video, I was like, you know what, let's just do another one for Halloween. And then I thought about, well, what should I talk about for a Halloween D4DJ video? And honestly, it just kept dwelling on my mind that I needed to do a follow-up to D4DJ and Father Figures 3, Revenge of the Nova. Because while that video was primarily preoccupied with the whole identity of Lumina, I never actually did a psychological profile, which is something I tend to do in these D4DJ essays, but I didn't do it for that one. So I was like, you know what? Let's actually do a psychological profile on Lumina. At least the... How do I put this? At least, you know, a more updated psychological profile, because Lumina is one of the most, like... What's the word I'm thinking of? It's, like, dynamic characters. Like, she has changed the most out of most characters. And, of course, I think there's an interesting reason for that. And I thought about this as one when I was way back when I was doing the Mooney essay. And I was like looking at some parallels between Mooney and Kokoa. And of course, how I made the joke in both videos. The Lonely Moon and the Mooney video. About how there was this kind of like flirting with death in the Mooney story, and then they never pulled the trigger, because the problem would be that if you killed off Mooney's mom, then you'd have to completely change Mooney's character, and I don't think they wanted to do that. So instead of like trying to pull the trigger on that idea, they just made a new character, and Kokoa serves that purpose. And so in the same vein, in a way, like a lot of the Unicorn, and especially like Unicorn and Abyssmare characters, I think the reason why they were even brought in, aside from the whole like music marketing thing, but like the way they were characterized in Groovy Mix was so they could tell those kind of stories, a lot grittier, darker themed stories, without the need of like compromising, changing the main 6 units. They're like, oh, we just make new characters to like flirt, like not just flirt with those darker ideas and darker and more mature themes, but just go on ahead and do it. And a character that really embodies this well is, of course, Unicorn's Ichihashi Lumina. So, just a quick kind of review of D4DJ and Father Figures 3, Revenge of the Nova, if you haven't seen that one. Basically, I was making a case of Neo's father, Nova. And yes, I'm not going to call him like Dr. Nova every time. I hate calling him that every time. I just call him Nova. Even though technically Nova is also, like, Neo is also a Nova, so... But we'll refer to Dr. Nova as just Nova. Because I hate calling him Doctor every time. So... The point of the case I was making in D4DJ and Father Figures 3 was the idea that like Nova was effectively isekai'd as a Lumina. And of course I have this whole discourse of there being like multiple Luminas, and we'll cover that in a lot of detail later, because I know that's something like I've flirted with those ideas in previous Lumina videos, but I never actually like broke down the multiple Luminas. But we'll cover that in a bit. But with that said, what the writing direction ended up doing was it made Nova an isekai character as a Lumina, or one of the personalities within Lumina. Is another way of thinking about it. And there's a bunch of reasons why they would do that, and I go into a lot more detail of the writer's logic in Revenge of the Nova. So don't forget to check that out if you haven't seen it yet. Anyway, this stream serves to be a continuation of that. And we're going to actually do a psychological profile on the Nova personality of Lumina. And so that is where I will refer to as, hence the title of this presentation, Lumina, the Mask of Trauma. Analyzing Unicorn's Ichihashi Lumina psychological profile and the ghost hiding underneath. A Streaming Parson D4DJ presentation. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. So, the first thing we gotta talk about is if Nova is in fact isekai'd as a Lumina, why not just be himself? Why not just be Nova isekai as Lumina, as opposed to developing an entire personality for Lumina? And the first thing I really want to kind of convey this idea of Lumina being the mask. And so Lumina is it's one of those things that, like, we will come back to this because there is something, it worked as a double-edged sword, that there's a statement that I kind of used to prove is a strong word, but very strong evidence of Nova being a Lumina. But that same line prevents me from kind of theorizing that we could blur the lines between Lumina and Nova and saying that they're one and the same. That the story effectively does make them two different people. They are two separate personalities, well distinct from each other within the Lumina being, I guess you could say. But with that said, I still want to kind of explore the idea of Nova cultivating a Lumina personality and why he would even do it. So, Nova's story in Groovy Mix is that he continuously wrestles with his sense of shame and guilt for not being the man he should have been. This is something I loosely talked about in Father Figures 3. But, and I mean, I talked a lot about it more in the Electric D4DJ and Father Figures 2, Electric Digaloo. I talk about a lot more detail there. And basically it's this idea that Nova, after he abandoned Neo, he came to realize that he was like, he totally failed as a father. And so he was like, well, damn, you know, like I wasted so much of my life trying to revive the voice of Arya. And so, what would I have so many regrets about that. And so that is a common theme used in isekais. This whole like, oh man, like if things were different, if I could go back and do things differently. And so D4DJ kind of used that, even though like it's not your typical like isekai with like the truck running over somebody, which is like, you know, the whole joke trope in isekais. But Nova is still an isekai character, and we'll talk a little bit more of how that could possibly be the case. Or how he would have been isekai'd, if you will. But the main point is that Nova, he was so ashamed of the fact that he failed to be Neo's father. And so I talked about in Program Personhood, as well as Electric Digaloo, that he reprogrammed Lumina to be the father figure he failed to be. Because he realized that is the most important thing in his life. But throughout, we don't really see a lot of what would have caused him to have that epiphany. We just see that, like, okay, he was a terrible dad because he was too preoccupied with trying to revive the voice of his wife. And then we jump to like the end of his life and he has the epiphany. And so there's hardly much of a journey between those two things. But what is kind of interesting in the way that Lumina is characterized is that they didn't need to do that because Nova was going to go through all of that again as Lumina. And so the identity of Lumina is a mask that Nova wears, but due to him being hit by lightning, he forgets that, oh, that was what I was supposed to be doing. And so the Lumina mask is not his second chance to try and fix things with his daughter, but instead he basically uses it to run away from his problems. And once again, it really this is where like a lot of people get that whole feeling that like Nova is like a terrible father. He's such a bad person. He's like one of the worst people in D4DJ, which I'm like, okay, that's a bit extreme. I don't think like he's the worst. He's awful, but I wouldn't put him as the worst. Hey Athena, welcome to the stream. Thank you for loving D4DJ. You know, like I've been a huge fan. There's one of those things that like as I get older, it's hard for me to maintain attention in like different animes and music and whatnot as I get older. But D4DJ is one that has stuck, oddly enough, and you can tell because I've been making these like video essays for like 2 years almost. Whoa. 2 years goes by fast, huh? But anyway, back to Nova being the broken man that he is. But because Lumina forgot, as Lumina forgot some of that, he instead uses the Lumina identity to run away from his problems. And so the reason why we didn't have to see the journey Nova goes through between him abandoning Neo and his epiphany that we see in Lumina's flashback at the end of Side Nova is because he goes through that all over again through Lumina, as a Lumina. He goes through all of that again, and that is the part that we, the audience, get to see. Now, the question that we need to be addressed is, how much we want to say that his bad behavior, if you will, is attributed to his sense of grief. Now, I want to lay that at the beginning of this discourse because on the one hand, it would be used to well explain his reasoning, and Lumina does a fair amount of doing this. In fact, one of the parts where the writers were really tipping their hand that Nova is Lumina, or Lumina is Nova, and I will treat them as interchangeable at this point. Even though, yes, we will get to the statement about how they are two different people. But as far as the analyzing their journey together that they take, it's really Nova's story and Lumina's along for the ride. And so the question is, how much can we attribute his bad behavior to his grief? Not that it justifies his behavior, but to really understand his motivation as a villain, if you will. Because even though, yes, we will come back to this, because I know like there's a huge like discourse. I don't know how much of the stream time it will eat, but there's a huge discourse of like how evil Mitsuhashi Sho actually is as a person. But despite how evil Sho actually is, Nova is still viewed as the main villain of Side Nova, and even Crossbeat. He is the main villain. But of course, this is where, and once again, we'll get into a lot more of this when I cover the Crossbeat section of the presentation. But Nova is a very interesting, like, Nova was the character that D4D, the writer, oh, what's his name? I can't remember his name. Someone could fact check it. They do tell you what his name is at the beginning of Side Nova. But the writer of Side Nova and Crossbeat really went like gung-ho with like this huge character arc for this one character. And then Unicorn and Abyssmare, the reason why they're so dynamic as characters is so that they could really explore this theme that Nova is supposed to embody. But we'll break through that as we take a look at his psychological profile. But with that said, the reason why I'm going to do this whole, like, treat Lumina and Nova as interchangeable is because Lumina is the mask. And Nova is the person. And hence why I keep making the Ghost in the Shell reference. Lumina is the shell, Nova is the ghost. And of course Lumina is a fake persona that's made. Because why face your problems when you can just pretend to be your dead wife? So, before we continue a lot more of why I justify Nova being a Lumina, is because there are actually 4 Luminas. Now, I know some smartass might want to say, well, technically, Lumina can duplicate herself infinitely, so there's like an infinite amount of Luminas. But you know that's not what I mean when I say there are 4 Luminas. When I say there are 4 Luminas, I mean that from a narrative standpoint and what they represent, there are 4 distinct Luminas. And it also goes with like D4DJ's theme of fours. You know, yeah, keep the pattern of fours going. So, there are 4 Luminas. So we're gonna cover them in a bit more detail. But for now, we'll just talk about like which is which. And then later we'll talk a bit more about like what happened to each of them up to the current story. So Lumina 1 is the original. Lumina 1 is the original, created in a New York lab. She self-destructs due to scientists hitting some kind of kill switch, as she was too hard to control. She then reconstructs herself over 20 years and returns as Proto-Lumina, and that's how Crossbeat begins. So Lumina 1 is the original. Some years later, a second Lumina is created. A new Lumina is built in a cabin in the American wilderness. Nova succeeds in having Aria's voice recreated. After Nova's epiphany, though, as I mentioned earlier, he begins reprogramming Lumina 2. Hey, Gauntlets, welcome to the stream. Yes, thank you. Things are going pretty well. It was a long-ass day today. That's why I started a little bit late. Anyway, so that's the part you see at the end of Side Nova. In Side Nova 9 Supernova. The flashback you see is a memory from Lumina 2. And that's where Nova succeeds in creating Lumina. And then he was going to reprogram her. And he gave her a second he changed her primary objective. And her primary objective was to find Neo and be the father figure he failed to be. However, unfortunately, both of them are killed. Nova and Lumina 2. They're killed by Lightning Kun, as indicated by the thunder that you hear at the end of the flashback. However, Lightning Kun is no match for the absurd powers of Lumina, because due to his proximity to Lumina 2, Nova's consciousness is preserved by Lumina 2. And he's probably brought into the digital dimension. So I know this explanation is a little bit far-fetched, but this is the best in-universe explanation I have for how how Nova can be a Lumina. Because the story basically tells you, like, yeah, this is a thing, and never explain how this happened. So I'm giving you the best explanation I can think of how Nova became a Lumina. So anyway, him and Lumina 2 are in this digital dimension that's later revealed to be the Sea of Electrons. And so, due to the two of them being effectively killed by Lightning Kun, the Sea of Electrons creates a backup of both of them. Now, we need to cover a caveat of how Lumina 2 would have been able to pull Nova's consciousness into the Sea of Electrons. But what you learn in Crossbeat 5. What you learn in Crossbeat 5 is that Lumina was always designed to have this kind of psychic power that can pull people's minds into the Sea of Electrons. After all, that was the very purpose why Lumina was created, the original. Lumina 2 is based on the original and is assumed to have all the same abilities. This is what Lumina explains to all the main characters in Crossbeat 5. So basically, I'm using the logic of, since Proto-Lumina can psychically pull people in and out of the Sea of Electrons, there's no reason Lumina 2 cannot do it. If you need a refresher, there's this doofy plot hole in Crossbeat, if you remember. It's in Crossbeat Part 6. Yeah, Crossbeat Part 6. Or Chapter 6 or whatever. And there's a part where, after like LMO and Call of Artemis appear in the D4 virtual D4 Fest, which is his own like Deus Ex Machina moment, there's a part where Neo is pulled into the Sea of the digital dimension. Not quite the Sea of Electrons, but like the virtual D4 Fest as part of the digital dimension. Neo is pulled there, but if you paid attention to the story, you would know that Neo is not hooked up to any like VR tech that would have brought her to the virtual dimension. Neo is supposed to be in a coma in some like posh hospital somewhere in Tokyo. So it begs the question, how did Neo get there? And so the explanation that the story did not cover very well is that Neo and Proto Lumina had a psychic connection, because that was how Proto Lumina hypnotized her in the first place. And so with that connection, apparently Proto Lumina can just pull Neo's consciousness into the digital dimension. And she's the older model. So Lumina 2 it's safe to assume that Lumina 2 can also do this, because she is created from the same information. That information is confirmed as the memento necklace that Neo has, that her father left her before he abandoned her. The necklace has like all the information of the original Lumina. And then I guess Nova's so smart, he just had it memorized and was able to replicate it when he created Lumina 2. So that's the explanation of how like Lumina 2 would have been able to pull his consciousness into the Sea of Electrons. And maybe it was just like an automatic subroutine in the Lumina programming that Nova dies right next to her. Well, they're both killed by a lightning gun. And then Lumina just, by automation, pulled his consciousness into the Sea of Electrons. But due to their injuries, quote unquote, the Sea of Electrons created a fourth Lumina. So that is Lumina 4. Lumina 4 is born in the Sea of Electrons, and this is an important detail. She's born in the Sea of Electrons. A new Lumina is born. After developing enough consciousness, she left the Sea of Electrons, following a program of be the greatest singer in the world. What is assumed to have happened, though the story doesn't explain this very well either, is that when Lumina 4 left the Sea of Electrons, the other two still existed inside of her, because she is created from both of them. Of course, this you read in the slides that this is going to change in Crossbeat, and we'll cover that story beat quite a bit, because it's actually a very important detail, and I did do some injustice to Revenge of the Nova when I did not talk about this particular detail, because it's actually a very important detail. I will refer to Lumina 4 as Unicorn Lumina, if I ever have to like talk about the different Luminas in the same breath. So Lumina 1 is Proto Lumina. Lumina 2, I will keep calling her Lumina 2. Lumina 3 is Nova, and Lumina 4 is Unicorn Lumina. So there are your 4 Luminas. Now, when I mentioned with the detail of Luminas 2 and 3 hitching a ride in Lumina 4's subconscious after she left the Sea of Electrons, this was one of the things that I was wrestling with when I made the Program Personhood video, as Lumina 4 draws her personality from both of them. That was the point of that video, and she goes back and forth between them. However, there's actually an interesting detail in Crossbeat that needs to be addressed. So, if you remember in Crossbeat 6, I should have had the video on hand. So I'm gonna hope you guys remember this and just go off memory. But I know where it happened, so you can look it up later if you need to fact check me. So in Crossbeat 6, there's the part where Lumina has the whole like big plan of luring Proto Lumina to the virtual D4 Fest. And while they're there, Proto Lumina attacks Lumina, because her Proto Lumina's plan was to absorb her ego so that she could develop a personality. What's kind of overlooked is that Proto Lumina actually succeeds in this plan. That's why Lumina gets knocked out when they come in contact. But with the 4 Luminas discourse I just covered, it covers I think it's a way of covering the plot hole. Because Proto Lumina ends up like going AFK for like all like 5 minutes. There's like a huge scene that happens. LMO shows up, and then Call of Artemis show up. Lumina has the whole dream sequence, which is actually a very important moment in Crossbeat. And I think I'm not sure if people caught on to this, but when I look at that scene, I see that Proto Lumina actually succeeded. She actually did absorb Lumina's consciousness. But that begs the question, well, how come Lumina is fine afterwards? And I think that's because while Proto Lumina was successful in her plan, what she didn't account for was that there were 3 Luminas inside of, well, Lumina 4. Well, 2 others, basically. There are 3 Luminas. And so Proto Lumina absorbed one of them, and then, due to who that was, she goes into shock. So, I've kind of been beating around the bush, but basically what happened, and this is why, like, we can now call Lumina 2 Pumina. Because that's who Pumina ultimately is. She's Lumina 2 and 1 merge into one being. Proto Lumina absorbed her, and then due to Lumina 2's last real memory was being hit by lightning, that put Proto Lumina into shock, and that's why she was AFK for like 5 minutes. She goes into shock, and then everything else happens. While that's happening, you actually go into Lumina 4's mind, and she has a dream, which is interesting because if you remember back in New Star Unicorn, the New Year's story, Lumina explicitly says that as an AI, she doesn't dream. She doesn't have dreams because she's an AI program. But in Crossbeat, she supposedly has a dream. And the dream is interesting. So if you remember it off the top of your head, once again, like, I didn't have the video on hand here. So you'll have to look it up yourself in Crossbeat 6. There's a moment where Lumina has a dream, and it's where it's Nova before he activates Lumina 2. And it's him, like, he's like praying, he's like, oh, you know, like, please let this work, please let this work. Like, Aria, your voice will be revived. Which is a very interesting sequence, because I mentioned in Program Personhood that it felt weird that Lumina would have a dream that is about Nova's obsession with reviving Aria's voice. Because Lumina already knows that Nova had his epiphany and he changed his mind about it, as Side Nova 9 is before Crossbeat 6. So it's kind of weird that happened. But when I look at it again, and we have the 4 Luminas discourse, I think what is actually happening is that the story is telling us that Lumina 2 is no longer part of Lumina 4. That they have become separate beings. They were separated. Proto Lumina absorbed Lumina 2, leaving Luminas 3 and 4 as one being, and Luminas 1 and 2 as another being. And so, this is actually... we'll cover this in a lot more detail later, but that's the real reason why Lumina's personality changes a lot after Crossbeat. This is especially fleshed out in Unicocolot, but there are hints of it here and there in the Halloween story. Last year's Halloween story with Michiru, Lumina, Neo, and Sophia. In those stories, you notice that Lumina's personality changed quite a bit. And then you see more of that in Lumina's demeanor and how she kind of behaves when you get to the reverse stories. So like Crossroads of Abyssmare. And then of course, Ifcord. Lumina's personality changed quite a lot because I think what the story was getting at is that Lumina 2 being removed from Lumina 4, it leaves Lumina 3, aka Nova, to be the only other the only personality. Because what's interesting, as I've talked about in Program Personhood, is that the two of them kind of counterbalance each other. And so Lumina 2 is the kind of view that Nova has of Arya to recreate Arya as a new AI being. And Lumina 2 is more Arya, if you will. And throughout Side Nova and Crossbeat, Lumina tried to cultivate more of the Arya personality. But after Crossbeat, that kind of is dropped. And that's probably because the Arya personality of Lumina was encoded in Lumina 2, and when Proto Lumina absorbed that, all of that left Lumina 4, or Unicorn Lumina. And you kind of really see this when you see how Pumina behaves. Pumina is very, like, she's very carefree. She's very easygoing. She's very... she's very relaxed. And I know it kind of gets blurred with, like, a childish demeanor, because there's also, like, Proto Lumina being... There's a whole, like, daughter dynamic with Proto Lumina. So you combine, like, Arya's carefree, peppy personality with Proto Lumina's childish immaturity. Let's just go with that. But then, of course, with that said, with Nova and Lumina 4 sharing a consciousness, due to how cynical Nova actually is, Lumina starts reflecting a lot of that in her actions. And so when we get to the end of Crossbeat, we have Lumina's 1 and 2 as Pumina, and Lumina's 3 and 4 as, well, Unicorn Lumina. And then, of course, and it was one of those funny things. It was like, okay, so at the end of Crossbeat made this big deal that, like, oh yeah, you know, like, both Pumina and Lumina can exist in one body. That was what the android body was made for. But then you get to, I think it's as early as a Bad Cynic Doggo. Or maybe it wasn't I think it was a Bad Cynic Doggo. Or was it later in the Arasugawa Student Council? Did they wait that long? I don't remember. No, it might be the Arasugawa Student Council Chronicles. And in the beginning of that story, it has the whole, like, Lumina separates them. So, like, Crossbeat did this whole thing about, like, oh yeah, we can exist in one being now. But then later they end up being split apart anyway. So it's just like, oh, what? Like, why did you make a big deal out of the whole, like, oh yeah, they can actually coexist in one body when you were gonna separate them anyway? But I think the reason why they needed to do that was because if they wanted to really hone in on Nova's personality, they have to keep Lumina's 2 and 3 separate. Because as we saw in Side Nova and early Crossbeat, if the two of them are together, they constantly counteract each other. So if Nova starts being cynical, Lumina 2 will be like, you know, turn that frown upside down. And then when Lumina 2 is too, like, she's too relaxed, Nova goes, no, we gotta be serious and act like a real AI program. So they counteract each other all the time. Alright, so the next line I have here is called A Ghost Feeling Guilt, Haunting the Narrative. And Arya fulfills a writing trope called haunting the narrative. So I guess a quick crash course on what haunting the narrative is. It's a writing trope where you have a character, through their existence or lack thereof, you see the effects of this character through how other people view them, even though they are not really present in the story. So Arya is basically that character. Even though Arya is not around, we know a lot about her. Since Arya was introduced in the beginning of Side Nova, she continuously haunts the story as her relationship to Nova directly affects the story. And that's where, like, it's weird to think of it this way, but like, it's also why Nova and especially Crossbeat end up being so weird compared to every other D4DJ story. Is because that relationship of Arya, who's been dead for like years in universe, she's been dead for like 8 years, and Nova, who's, we don't even know at the time it's Nova, but their relationship affects everyone else in the story, and it's like so weird to think of it that way. And you think about how, you know, everybody talks smack about how Nova's like a horrible father, because he is. And the reason for that is because of the relationship dynamic that was a lot of unsettled feelings between Arya and Nova. Their relationship is the most important relationship in D4DJ because it affects so many other things. Of course, one of the big ones is Neo and all of her, you know, her massive daddy issues. Is because after Arya died, Nova felt like he had nothing, even though like his daughter's right there. Like that, like from Neo's perspective, that's why he's such a bad guy, because all her dad could think about is like her mother who's gone, and completely ignores her existence. Well, not ignores her, but he doesn't treat her like a real person. He only treats her as an extension of Arya. He doesn't treat Neo as her own person. He viewed his daughter as an extension of his wife, because in his mind, she's the only person that actually mattered. And from Neo's perspective, that's so soul-crushing. And I mentioned, and the way I stated it in D4DJ and Father Figures 2 was that, you know, the purpose of your father, a father figure in your life, if you will, because, you know, not everybody has their dad around, unfortunately, but the purpose of a father figure is to be that person in your life who tells you he believes in you. And having that person give you that faith and confidence is what allows you to face all the challenges of life. But the problem is Neo never had that growing up. She was constantly told by her father that you have to be someone else, you have to be someone else. Which very well plays into when he becomes the Lumina, he constantly tells himself that. Because that's basically how much he basically worshipped his wife. When he told his daughter, you have to be Arya. When that didn't work, he ends up being like, well, I have to be the new Arya. So, like, that relationship affects everything. And so Arya constantly haunts the narrative. Now the big question that needs to be asked is how much of this haunting pushes Nova into the realm of PTSD? So obviously there's some trauma out of like there's obviously some trauma out of Arya dying. But how far are we willing to push to say that, like, does it actually develop into a form of PTSD? This is something I don't think there's a definitive answer. I don't have a definitive answer. And so it's something that, but it's worth thinking about, because while it doesn't excuse his behavior, it really grounds his motivation as a villain. I mentioned this earlier, but Nova is the villain of both Nova and Crossbeat, which I know sounds funny because if he's also Lumina, he's also the hero of both those stories. So he's both the villain and the hero of the story. And his relationship with Arya, who's not around in the story, is an important factor to that dynamic. That Nova arm wrestles between him fighting his past. And that's why he's the past version of himself is the villain, but the new life he's given is supposed to go through like a hero's journey and be the hero of the story. Now when it comes to the PTSD thing, I just wanted to point out a quick kind of idea that people forget that if I were to argue the side of Nova having PTSD, it makes a lot of sense that he would develop it. And that's because we don't think about it as much, and there's reasons for that. I'll get into it in a second. But according to, I remember I was reading some stats. You read the University of Boston study of causes of PTSD. A lot of people forget that death of a family member is actually pretty high up on that list. Now, a lot of people may not think that like death of a family member causes PTSD. Well, one, because the media doesn't talk about it as much. And there's good reason for that, because think of it this way. A lot more people may develop PTSD through death of a family, but that's because a lot more people go through it. Because when people think of like PTSD, we think of things of like military combat. Now the difference is like, yes, if you go through military combat, the chances of you developing PTSD is higher. But statistically, less people go through that. So that's why those numbers are lower. But everybody goes through death of a family at some point. And of course, even within that, there are a lot of variables. So for instance, if death of a family member happens kind of later in your life, and it's someone that's like older, like for example, when my grandmother passed away when I was like in my mid-20s. Well, that's completely different. That's like the chance of developing PTSD from that is super low. Because as my grandmother was aging and, you know, approaching death's door, I had already rationalized through all of that. I've already processed all of that and rationalized it. Of like, okay, my grandmother's like super old. She's almost 90. You know, it is what it is. It's just part of life. But you think of like inversely, and it's one of those things that like, you know, you never wish this on anyone. But if a person had to deal with like death of a child, the death of their child, that is more likely to cause PTSD than say like you losing your grandparent. Because when your grandparent grows old and is preparing to die, you go through steps to process that. But when it comes to a child, like nobody expects that, and it's a travesty because of that's not, from a rational sense. Well, that's not natural. You know, there's supposed to be like a sequence to events in like the chain of life and the evolution of life. There's supposed to be like a natural order to things, and so if that is disrupted, that's likely to cause forms of PTSD. So if a person, say, loses their child, they're more likely to develop PTSD. And so we could make that argument with Nova, as him and Arya were pretty young. Especially Arya was pretty young when she died. So supposedly, based on Neo's information in Side Nova Finding Neo, or Part 4, Neo mentions that her mother died when she was 9. Now, we don't actually know when Arya gave birth to Neo. We have some like shaky information and then just kind of like do some math to try and guess. So if you go with the younger age of Irie, when Irie talks about her meeting Arya like years ago, which is one of those funny things that like it's a doofy plot hole where it's like, how would Irie remember any of this? Because Irie would have been at oldest like 6 years old. And the math goes like this. So Arya supposedly died when Irie was in 3rd year high school. She was like her and Call of Artemis already broke up. She was with Mana doing the Scarlet Canary, which was supposedly in her 3rd year of high school. During that time, it was during that year Arya died. And so Irie describes it as being like roughly 8 years ago for her. So basically the simple math is she's like 17, 18 when that happened. You just take that plus 8, making her 25, 26. And then because Groovy Mix is doofy and has a frozen timeline, she's stuck at 25, 26. We have to say, Neil also mentions that that would have happened when she was 9. So you add 8, second year, she'd be like 16, 17. So we know that Irie met Arya before she got married to Nova, because Irie did not know who he was. And so I used 20 years because my theory was that Nova created Proto Lumina and was forced to kill his own daughter. Oh, spoilers for certain dynamics. We're going to talk about his psychological profiling. But basically, he's supposedly the scientist that had to hit the kill switch that caused her to self-destruct. So he effectively destroyed his own creation. After that, and Crossbeat tells us that was 20 years prior to the main story. So he would have gone back, and then he would have married Arya after that. But then, of course, we have to give like at least a year, because it takes, at least 9 months to make a baby. And remember, this is assuming that they got married the moment he got back, which is not how things work in real life. So we probably have to add a couple of years in that. But even with, so let's say they were 21 when Neil was born. Let's give him a couple of years between. An important detail is that Irie mentions that when she met Arya when she was 6, Arya was already an adult. So let's just lowball it and say she was 18. And then add a couple of years before Neil is born. And then you have to add 9 years, because that's when Neo stated that her mom died. So I would say like Arya's like roughly 30 when she dies. Now I know that was a long tangent, but basically the short of it is, if you lose your spouse at the age of 30, that's pretty good cause of developing PTSD. Now it's not, once again, like it's not a 100% hit shot when it comes to like developing PTSD from like dealing with death at an early age. But in Nova's case, we could very well make that argument that he probably developed PTSD because him and his wife were about 30, and then she died. So that's pretty devastating for a 30-year-old young married guy. And so it's very likely he developed PTSD. That's the case I'm going to make of him having PTSD. Once again, does that justify his behavior towards his daughter? No, it doesn't. But it does give him a clear motivation as to why he acts the way he does and why he is a bad guy. Because, once again, PTSD is not an excuse to have bad behavior. But it does explain why he's basically a crazy person, as Neo describes him. Neo kind of describes him as like, he wasn't a rational person. This is in Side Nova 8. I'm trying to remember. It's called, is it Breakthrough? I think it's Breakthrough. I think that's what chapter 8 of Side Nova is called. I think it's called Breakthrough. I should have looked at my notes before. I should have looked at that note before I did this, but anyway. Nova, it's very possible he developed PTSD because there's also more to his personality that is more likely to develop PTSD because he's not the kind of guy to go through grief very well. And so, yes, I am blurring the lines between grief and post-traumatic stress disorder. But I think it's important to think about how Nova goes through the 5 stages of grief. So, Lumina and the 5 stages of grief. So, just real quick, the 5 stages of grief are denial. Well, okay, the caveat is you don't go through these. Well, the first 4 you don't go through in like a linear order. But of course, acceptance is always last. Otherwise, you would, like, once you've accepted things, and the other ones stop being, you know, as troubling in the struggle to acceptance. Because the whole point of the other 4 stages is that you struggle to accept the reality of things. But the other 4 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, and depression. And people move, and when you, and going through the stages of grief, you go back and forth between them. And they're not in any particular order, and you go back and forth between them. This is definitely true of Nova. Likely pre-isekai, but definitely post-isekai. As we actually see the stages of grief in Lumina's personality. And I think that's where it's really interesting to look at Lumina's psychological profile, because a lot of her character is, that's why she acts as strange as she does. She acts out the way that she does in various scenes, which we will cover some of those scenes, or at least I'll talk about them, and I'll give you the cross-reference to look them up. But you kind of see that Lumina goes through the stages of grief, which sounds strange because when Lumina's introduced in the story, you're like, what is she grieving from? We don't know. But considering if chord that Lumina is Nova, then we know that even as early as Psi Nova, Lumina is going through the stages of grief, because the world, the in-universe logic is that even though Nova came to acceptance at the end of Psi Nova 9 in the flashback, because he gets killed by Lightning Kun and then Lumina forgets everything he recorded, Nova has to go through that again. And he has to go through that again as Lumina. And so we have denial. Nova's denial is him adopting Arya's personality. That is why, even as Lumina, he doesn't act as himself. He acts as Arya does. And that's really him ignoring the reality that that Arya's gone. It's him ignoring that reality, because he's basically saying, no, I'm the new Arya. Even though he doesn't know that's what he's doing. And of course, there's the whole, like, he's also in denial of him being a terrible father. That he runs away from his problems. Then we have anger. Anger is actually the stage of grief we see of Nova the most. Because Lumina, what makes Lumina interesting as a character is that since Lumina's the Arya personality within Lumina is a mask, it's a fake version of Nova, obviously the mask is gonna slip. And when the mask slips, then that's when Nova comes out of Lumina. And we see those moments where, even before Crossbeat, before Lumina 2 and Nova are separated, there are moments where he is the dominant personality and he slips out. This is most evident. Well, there are 2 times where it's really evident. The first time where it's really evident is in Psi Nova 5. Leader. I think that's what the chapter's called. Psi Nova 5 Leader. And in Leader, what happens is Lumina starts putting Unicord through like a tough, like an intense training regiment to like improve their musical skills before they attend the Yoba cross-cultural kind of DJ festival. They have something like that too. The whole point of it was the main 6. No, not the 6. It's more like well, the high schoolers. So that would be Happy Round, Peaky, Photon Maiden, Lyrical Lily. They do like a kind of a, what's the word I'm thinking of? Lumina even uses this word. Camaraderie between the DJ units before they try and challenge Abyssmare on their turf. And so Lumina's Lumina sets Unicorn to do like some intense training regimen. And as time passes, Unicorn goes like, oh man, like you're working us too hard, like this is so much work. And then they have their kind of disagreement where Coco wants to make a new song. And Lumina goes, that's dumb because we're supposed to be training for an upcoming music festival. Like you don't have time for that. And so Lumina, when Coco and Lumina start arguing, Lumina drops that peppy, kind, and the nice personality. And Lumina actually becomes kind of mean. And almost abusive. Because Lumina basically starts threatening them. And it's like, you guys gotta get back in line, kind of thing. And that's where Coco tries to have Michiru's opinion, because Michiru is supposed to be the team leader. And Michiru's indecisive. And then that's what, makes Hayate leave, and then Coco leaves later because of Michiru's indecisiveness. But in that conflict, Lumina becomes very abusive. Of course, there's supposed to be a parallel between Unicorn and Neo. And that's where, through Lumina, we understand a lot of Nova's personality. That he's the kind of person to act out if he doesn't get his way. And I did explain earlier that some of that may be PTSD, but at the same time, it doesn't excuse that he is kind of really, he's abusive. He actually becomes abusive. And Lumina expresses a fair amount of it. There are a few other moments, but one example is like the needy streamer overdose collab. Lumina basically, once again, she kind of threatens the Unicorn girls. She does it more subtly. But she more or less threatens them. Because Lumina is very controlling. And that's kind of the way you expect an angry scientist to behave. Is that he feels like he has to have everything in control. And Lumina reflects this. Then you get to Crossbeat, and in Crossbeat, when Lumina is trying to organize the other DJ units to help her in this whole virtual D4 Fest plan, Lumina's very abusive. She has no regard for the safety of any of the main units. I even made the joke in Program Personhood where Mooney has concerns about this plan, because Mooney's like, hold on, if we're all in this virtual D4 Fest and this Proto Lumina attacks, what happens if she attacks us? And Lumina basically just like, don't worry about it. You just do what you're told. It's like, wow, like no regards for Mooney's concern whatsoever. Because when Lumina starts having some anger, she becomes abusive. And that anger stems from somewhere. And I think there's something within Lumina's psyche, which in hindsight would be like, okay, that's the Nova personality within Lumina. That he's a very angry person. And it makes him, see, this just makes him look worse. Because, he's supposed to be the adult in the room. And yet he's like lashing out at teenage girls. Like he's such an asshole when you look at him that way. He really is. Because yes, he has angry moments with a bunch of teenage girls. Like they're teenage girls. Like cut him some slack. But he's like, no. He's so mean to them. We have bargaining. So I mentioned this earlier, but that is Nova trying to revive Arya through any means necessary. That's bargaining. And so he tried that with his daughter. Didn't work. So he tries with some AI voice modulator, which has some success. And then, well, that didn't last long because Lumina 2 is effectively killed by Lightning Kun, and so is he. He gets isekai'd, and he's like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna be the new Arya. So he basically does whatever he can to revive Arya, even using his second chance of life to do that. He would do anything to bring her back, even if it was to erase his own identity altogether. Finally, we get depression. Well, not finally. We have acceptance to deal with, but depression comes a lot later in Lumina's personality. And you see this a lot more after Crossbeat. You see a little bit of it because the problem is his depression and his anger bleed into each other. But at the end of Crossbeat, you can see that Lumina is very disappointed with Neo. And that's the whole, like, Neo's conviction of, like, you know, I can never forgive the old bastard kind of thing, because Neo still has a lot of anger issues towards her dad. And in that exchange, Lumina's actually a little bit disappointed, which actually hints at, like, oh, you know, Lumina really is Nova in Lumina's reaction to Neo's convictions. But you look at stories after Crossbeat, and now we have to address the elephant in the room. Okay, so before I talk about the elephant in the room, I know some people might think it's a radical idea of, like, Nova being Lumina, them being effectively the same person in most cases. And I understand a fair amount, like, people would give me pushback. And there's a very good reason for it. Even I'm like, yeah, I kind of don't like it either. Even though I made a whole video, like, defending the case that Nova is a Lumina. But there's a lot of implications about accepting that to be the case that is, it's kind of troubling. And some of that comes out in his depression and the way he expresses his depression. And that's where Lumina's sense of humor becomes a lot darker after Crossbeat. Lumina's a lot more, how do I put it? He's a lot more cynical. Lumina acts a lot more cynical. And as I mentioned before, that is likely due to Lumina 2 not, like, toning him down, if you will. But he becomes a lot more cynical. And that is expressed through his very dark sense of humor. And some of that dark humor involves kind of perverted jokes. And so, yeah, it's kind of terrible that, like, yeah, he's this older guy throwing these perverted jokes around, like, teenage girls. It's mad sauce. It's mad sauce. But that's kind of Lumina's way of, that's Nova's way of coping with his depression. Through Lumina. Lumina kind of treats it like it's a joke, but it comes out of a place of depression. Because he still has some unhappiness in his life. Of course, that will change, and we'll cover this in a lot more detail. But when we get to If Chord, that Lumina comes to acceptance. And accepts that Arya is gone. You can't change the past. No amount of pretending or denial is going to change that. If Chord allowed Nova to relive his enamored feelings, and remembering Arya the way he remembered her best. And in that last line, in that interaction, after Arya leaves, the fake Arya, if you will, Lumina says, "Thank you for being a precious memory." And that is Nova coming to acceptance. Okay, hang on. Whoops, no. Oh no, I jumped to the next slide. I did not mean to do that. Just checking my notes here. Yeah, no, I covered everything. Because another thing about Nova's psychological. I know we did. I cover a lot of like uh, tutorial stuff before we actually get into like his psychological profiling. But not only through Lumina going through the 5 stages of grief do we see a lot of Nova's personality, but we can understand a lot of his personality through Neo, because she really is like her old man. As much as she hates it, she really is like him. We can learn a lot about Nova's psychological profile by looking at Neo's personality and her psychological profile. Because it's what the story gets at is that Neo, she clearly takes after him than she does her mother. The obvious case is like they're both cold and they're very calculating in their movements. Everything to them is like, okay, there's a logical sequence and we maneuver our way through them to get an optimal result. That's how they think. Now, Lumina obviously displayed these inside Nova as well, especially in the whole pushing Unicorn. But even before that, like when Lumina was trying to get Unicorn together, and Cocoa was the one who's like, oh, I don't want to work with Michiru. Lumina's very calculating in how to almost manipulate Cocoa. And tries, like, borderline tries blackmailing her. it's Lumina's terrible. Lumina's terrible because Nova's terrible. Another thing about Neo that she clearly takes after the old man. Stories like Transmitted Heat at 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit and Crossroads of Abyssmare, there are moments where Neo she's kind of dorky. And this is where I've seen discussions in like the D4DJ Discord about how some people think that like Neo can be airheaded at times. It's not so much her being an airhead. A better description is that she's dorky, because despite her cool demeanor, she's an introverted nerd at the end of the day, and that's because she's just like her father. They're shy and they're awkward nerds. The confidence, like when Lumina exhibits confidence, that's because Nova is pretending to be Arya, and Arya is the one who exuberates confidence. But Nova is not like that at all. He's very shy. He's very reserved and dorky. And Neo also is that way. Especially you see a lot more in later stories, because Neo gets to be herself, if you will. Because the whole problem of when you look at Neo through Side Nova, it's because Neo is also wearing a mask, and that's the that was. I didn't word this very well back in D4DJ and Father Figures 2, but I think it makes more sense to talk about it this way now, especially when we're looking at Neo and Nova through the lens of Lumina. But they wear masks because they're both very insecure people, Nova and Neo. The Novas are insecure. So they're very insecure, and so when Neo acts all tough and overly serious, and she's not intimidated by anybody, that is all just a facade. That's just Neo trying to act tough, like she doesn't need anyone, and Neo wanted to try and prove herself so that she could make herself worthy for her father's affection. So Neo acted tough, but after Side Nova, and especially after Crossbeat, Neo started relaxing on that, because, well, a major part of Neo and Lumina's conversation in Side Nova Supernova is that Lumina is basically telling Neo, you don't have to follow someone else's dream. You can be yourself. And of course, the problem with Neo is that she doesn't know what that means. Like she doesn't know how to do that, because she's never done that her whole life. Her whole life was always be someone else, be someone else, be someone else. And so Neo had that ingrained in her mind. But in later stories, as she's trying to mature a little bit, she backpedals because Neo never got to be a kid. And so she has to kind of go back there and then start maturing. That's kind of Neo's struggle, but that's why Neo's so awkward. And it's kind of adorable to watch. It's very cute to watch Neo be dorky and awkward, because that's who she really is when she doesn't have to pretend to be someone else. And so there's an interesting parallel between Lumina and Neo, that they both wear a mask, because both Nova and Neo are very insecure. But of course, see, from Neo's perspective, you can't blame her for being insecure. She has no fault in that. None of that is her fault. It's because that's how much damage Nova did to her in his abusiveness. That all Neo could be was insecure. But that's also because Nova himself is very insecure. Oh, I didn't mention this, but this is a thing for a little while, but it gets toned down as well. But back when Neo inside Nova, where she tries to act all cool, you can tell there's already cracks in her armor, because she's very avoidant of others, especially of the other Abyssmere members. She's very avoidant of them because she's scared of them seeing the real her. And this comes full circle, actually, in, oddly enough, not an Abyssmere story, but in the reverse Piki story, the one where the second years of Yoba go to Kyoto. And there's a part where Neo and Kyoko are talking, and Neo talks about how, well, Abyssmere was made by Sho for the other three to elevate her. And so because Neo has this kind of responsibility, if you will, and this image to uphold, even to her own teammates, that's why Neo is so scared to show vulnerability. And that's why she, throughout, as like Side Nova, and still continues, that Neo is avoidant of others, which is also something of Nova's personality, because Lumina also has moments like that, where Lumina is avoidant of others. The whole running away from his problems. So the contrast in Side Nova, going back to Side Nova 5, is when, after Kokoa storms out because she gets super mad at Michiru's indecisiveness, and then Michiru's like in a panic. She's like, what do I do? What do I do? Right? Like, our unit's falling apart. And Lumina just goes like, oh, I'm gonna recalculate things. See ya. It just leaves Michiru, like, because Lumina is also avoidant. But that's because, once again, due to Nova losing his memories, he didn't feel the need to confront his problems. He felt like he could just run away from them. And that continued to plague him for years. And then it resurfaces in Lumina. And that, you can tell it's such a it's such a serious problem that he has, because it cultivates into Neo's, I don't want to say like idiotic mentality, but her unwillingness to be vulnerable, because Neo is so insecure and so scared of people seeing the real her. Even though, yes, even like, once again, with Neo, that drops from time to time, because you can only pretend for so long. You can only wear the mask for so long. Eventually it slips, eventually it cracks. And that's why there's such a strong parallel between Lumina and Neo, both inside Nova and Crossbeat. Speaking of Crossbeat, I'm going to answer a question I think it itches in the back of everybody's mind. And it's the question of, why is Crossbeat such a ridiculous, wonky-ass story? Hang on, I need to take a look at something real quick here. Okay. Alright, we good. Okay, so the question is, why is Crosby such a wonky ass story? And I know a lot of people like to poke fun at the whole like AI apocalypse thing with Proto Lumina, but the answer is actually a lot simpler than that. As a matter of fact, it has nothing to do with the science fiction elements. As a matter of fact, D4DJ was a science fiction long before Lumina even showed up inside Nova. Now I know a lot of people would argue that like, okay, there are some collabs, like some of it isn't collabs, which are not canon. Even though that's kind of problematic in itself because characters will refer to them as if they did happen. Dealing with Groovy makes this quote-unquote canonicity as dubious. Which is why, like, at the end of the day, I know a lot of people say just don't bother taking any of the stories seriously, but at that point, like, if you're not going to take any of it seriously, then why are you still, like, in this franchise? Why are you still bother with this game? Maybe other than, you know, playing the songs. Okay, that's a good reason. You wouldn't bother with any story if you're just going to be like, no story matters. But the point I'm making is that D4DJ was a science fiction long before Lumina showed up. So Crosby isn't a weird story because of the science fiction elements. The real reason why Crosby is such a weird story is because Crosby, what it's really about is a story of a father reconciling with his daughter. Now you're probably thinking like, huh? Right? Like, no other story is like this. And why would they need to be? Is the simple rebuttal to that. No other story is like this, and there's no reason for them to do that. But Crosby, I think that's an important thing to understand about Crosby, is that the theme is so different compared to every other D4DJ story. Because if you ask me, like, I was gonna use the Halloween story, but that's a bad example. Okay, like an older Halloween story, the magical girl one with Shinobu, Miko, Hiro, and Nagisa. Okay, what's that story about? It was a bunch of cute girls doing cute girl things. What's Road to D4 Fest Happy around about? Well, half of it is about cute girls doing cute girl things, and there's also about girls gotta grow up, because Maho has to kind of figure herself out a little bit. What's another story where, like, okay, the snowball fight with Happy Round and Lyrical Lily. That's just cute girls doing cute girl things. And then you get, like, girls gotta grow up stories, which is, you know, you have a bunch of, you gotta have some kind of moral teaching in your story. So you gotta have some girl gotta grow up stories. So it's like, okay, that's side origin rondo. That's mutual feelings conveys emotion. That's starry flowers with loved ones. And then you have the extremes of, like, you know, like every mermaid story is just a bunch of hot girls doing hot girl things. And so you have, like, D4DJ has this record of kind of just being like, okay, it's fun, it's upbeat, and very lighthearted. Yeah, you have some maturity moments and some, you know, moral lessons you want to teach. And then you go like, what's Crosby about? And it's like, yeah, it's about a father reconciling with his daughter. And you're like, huh? Like, it's no other story is like this. And it does feel weird. Especially, once again, if you compare Crosby to every other story. And even Side Nova. That's its major theme, and that's why it's so weird. But at the same time, that is the Lumina arc. Lumina's character arc, up to Crossbeat, was all about Nova trying to reconcile with his daughter. But at the same time, there's no final resolution to it. I mean, the story plays out that theme in a more hypothetical sense, because what the story kind of expands on is that there's more than one way to skin a cat, if you will. And so that does happen. A father does reconcile with his daughter. That happens in the form of of Lumina saving Proto Lumina from destroying herself in the self-destruction and all that. That's Nova reconciling with his oldest daughter, if you will, as Proto Lumina is technically his oldest daughter. She's the first one that he made, and there's an interesting parallel because the beginning of Crosby is him effectively killing his daughter. He's the one who hits the kill switch. At least the story implies that it was him doing it. That he effectively kills his daughter, and so that probably haunted him for years. That could very well be the reason why, even though, like, okay, so this is a weird way of painting the narrative, but Nova creates Proto Lumina, and then after he effectively kills her, he goes back to his hometown, marries Arya, and then they move back to New York. And you're like, why would he do that? But I think it's, once again, even as early as back then, he's constantly feeling senses, like a huge sense of shame for basically being a terrible father. And so he effectively killed his daughter at Lumina 1, or Proto Lumina. But then you contrast that to the end of Crosby, where he ends up saving her from self-destruction. So yes, Proto Lumina almost self-destructs twice. But he saves her the second time. And so he does reconcile with his daughter. But then you see the final exchange between Lumina and Neo, and they are not reconciled. Nova does not get to reconcile with Neo. Instead, the story basically is like, okay, we're not going to give it to you that easy because, well, Neo is a very complex person. And to be fair, she has years of damage that you caused. So, your reconciliation ain't going to come for free, buddy. And so, the story gives you like two different resolutions. One where he does reconcile with his daughter, and one where he doesn't. And so, there's this interesting thing where, like, I guess Nova has a bunch of daughters. He has, like, technically the two Luminas. Luminas 1 and 2 are his daughters. And then Neo is also his daughter. So he technically has 3 daughters. Lumina 4 is also technically his daughter, but Lumina 4 is like a weird case because she's not created by him. Unicorn Lumina was born, if you will, in the Sea of Electrons. So it's a little different there. And that actually, it makes me think about something else that we'll come to a little bit later. But going back to Crosby and Nova's attempts to reconcile with Neo, and it doesn't quite go through. But that's where, like, once again, there's that depression comes out of him because he was not satisfied with that. And I mean, on the one hand, he's probably thinking, like, look, like, I fixed things with my first daughter, I can fix things with this one. But it's like, well, not all daughters are the same. So, no, it's not going to be that easy, old man. But in Crosby, you see a lot of that anger and bargaining in the stages of grief. So the anger is, once again, the whole, like, after Neo gets hypnotized and then Lumina's, like, personality changes and she becomes, like, cold and calculating again. And then there's the bargaining of how Lumina's like, I'll do anything to save Neo. I'll do anything. And be willing to, like, use the rest of the D4DJ characters as cannon fodder. Like, that's how desperate Lumina acts. There's also another thing that I thought about. It's like, why did the story go out of its way to do this? And if, once again, it's one of those, like, okay, in hindsight, it makes sense that Lumina is Nova because of this weird action Lumina does in Crosby. And that is that everybody in universe also sees Nova as like a horrible person. In Crossbeat 5, once again, when Lumina's explaining the whole D4 project thing, and a lot of people are kind of not happy about this, and I can't remember who is the one that says it, but basically it's like, oh, it's all because of this Nova guy's fault. And then Lumina starts defending him. I'm like, huh, that's a interesting thing for Lumina to do. But I like to think that's because, like, since Lumina is Nova, he's obviously gonna try and self-justify it and be like, no, I was totally, like, it's totally fair game, I did this. Even though, like, most people would be like, no, you are not. But I think there's an interesting dynamic there where Lumina defends Nova. And of course you get to the final... Whoops. I did it again. Okay, no, I did not do it again. Let me just... There you go. And then you get to the final exchange in Crossbeat with Lumina and Neo. And once again, you see Lumina defending Nova's actions. The whole... And I tried to make this poetic thing in Program Personhood, where Lumina's like, you know, your father he left you for your benefit. He left you so that you didn't have to bear his guilt with him. And so in the end, it was actually good that he left, which is like, that's probably the craziest thing for Neo to hear. It's like Neo's thinking like, I went through years of psychological damage because of that guy. And now you're telling me that it was a good thing? Like, who do you think you are? It's probably what Neo's thinking. And that's probably why Neo reacts the way that she does. Because for Lumina to try and defend Nova's actions, or really Nova trying to defend his own actions to his daughter, and Neo getting angry about it, it's like, once again, part of his denial, and as I mentioned earlier, you go back and forth between the stages of grief. Part of his denial is thinking that, like, no, I was completely justified in doing what I did. And I'm going to ignore the fact that it caused years of psychological damage. And that's why, like, a lot of people are quick to side with Neo. And understandably so. Because, as Neo herself states, it's like, those are just excuses. Like, and I always made the joke, it's like, there's the line Neo has, and she's like, oh, I feel like all I'm hearing is just the old man's excuses. And I'm like, well, that's because you are. But while Lumina's giving that whole, like, defense of Nova, there's an interesting line that I've always liked. And it's the part where Lumina states, you know, he would have come back for you after everything was done. And then I was being as coy as I was a year ago. It's like, well, why does Lumina believe that Nova would return to Neo after the work was done? Well, that's because he did. He did come back as Ichihashi Lumina. Of course, this is contrasted with Neo's anger toward her father. And I think it's meant to show that, like, to keep the relationship dynamic between Lumina and Neo interesting, and, well, ultimately Nova and Neo interesting, is that he really has to earn his way into good graces with his daughter. And that is going to be a very steep uphill battle. Now, I know a lot of people would say that, like, okay, Neo says she's never going to forgive him. That's that. He shouldn't bother. Because she's never going to forgive him. Neo herself says that she'll never forgive him. So that's the end-all be-all. But if you think like that, you're also overlooking another core theme of Crossbeat. And that's the idea that anyone can change. And I think that's the beauty of Crossbeat's story. and how it plays into the theme of a father reconciling with his daughter. Let me say that again. The central theme of Crossbeat is that anyone can change. And you see that through Nova, you see that through Proto Lumina, and you see that through Unicorn Lumina. Who, by the way, are all immortal. All three of them are immortal, and yet they change. And of course, if you ever like read The Last Unicorn, or you played Fire Emblem Three Houses, an interesting way of writing immortals is that immortals have no motivation to change. So that's why it's easy to kind of paint them as like villainous at times, especially in Rhea's case in Three Houses, is because immortals don't have a reason to change. Because they're immortal, they live forever. Why would you need to change? But with the Luminas being able to change, there's hope in that. If they can change, Neo can change. There's hope for her. And I think that's something that, you know, as you watch more of Neo's character arc unfold, you see those little like the cracks, and even that you could even make the case that her saying that she would never forgive her father, that is also just part of the mask. Because if you look back inside Nova, Neo subconsciously does want her father back. Even, well, not just Side Nova, but early Crossbeat. Neo may say that, like, oh, you know, I don't care about the old bastard. But she deeply longs for him to return to her life. I mean, Neo kind of even implies this of why she even worked with Sho in the first place. Was because Sho kind of reminded her of her father. In his like cold and calculating demeanor. Neo kind of saw parts of her father in him. So, Neo... What's interesting about Neo is that Neo... She still has a bit of that mask of like, oh, she wants to act tough in front of Lumina. Be like, well, I can never forgive the old bastard. But... we also see scenes of her, like, she longs for him to come back to her life. Even though, like, she's also kind of accepted that he's dead. But, surprise, you know, the major plot twist is going to be like, oh, he's not dead. He's actually brought back to life as Lumina. He did come back for his daughter. Whoops. He did come back for his daughter. And, that's something that, you know, there's hope for. That there is still a hope for them to reconcile, even though Crossbeat did end on a kind of depressing note that Neo feels like she can't, because in her defense, she is still emotionally charged. Like, how could you say that him leaving me was a good thing? And I think when Nova tried to defend himself that moment, he realized that, like, oh, I can't do that. And so... when you see, and this is where, okay, I gotta go on a bit of a side track here, but when I was playing in the international version of Groovy Mix, I saw that some people were not too happy with the current event that we're having, the Digaket event, which is like their universe's version of Comiket. And people were like, oh my god, another Lumina story. And if you think about it, Lumina's had a lot of stories. Since Crossbeat. Lumina's had a lot of stories. Let's count them. First one was Halloween. Then there was Uni-Cocolot. And then we have... Lumina shows up in quite a few of the reverse stories. Oh yeah, let's not forget. A Bad Cynic Doggo, Lumina's around. She's not a major character in that one. But in... the Arasugawa Student Council Chronicles, Lumina is actually a very important character in that story, which is like, who does Lumina think she is? Just like taking the spotlight in a Lyrical Lily and not Lyrical Lily story. Like, who does Lumina think she is? But Lumina is like that's a pretty big Lumina story. And then we go to the reverse stories. So Lumina is in the Abyssmare story quite a bit. And then Um, of course, if chord. And then even at like the peaky one, she makes like an appearance at the end. And actually has some very interesting lines of dialogue in that short exchange. And so Lumina, and then now we have the Comic Cat story. So Lumina's had a lot of stories. I feel like I'm missing one. Halloween, Uni Cocolot, If Chord, Crossroad of Abyssmare, Gigacat. And then if you count like Arasagawa Student Council, that's like 6 stories that Lumina's in quite a bit in the last, like, the year since Crossbeat. It's been like a year and a half since Crossbeat, give or take. And so Lumina's had a lot of stories, and then everybody complains like, "Oh my God, Rondo's only had the Christmas story. They don't get anything." Photon Maiden hasn't had much in all that time, but Lumina's had like 6 stories, and people are like, "Oh my God, so much Lumina." And I know it's hard, like, I know this sounds like an excuse, but I think the writers really want to push this whole, like, no, like, Lumina really wants to try and make things right with Neo. And that's why there's a huge kind of character development for Lumina that goes just beyond her interaction with Neo, but with other characters. And there's an interesting dynamic, and I've been flirting with it here and there, but I think something interesting to look at when it comes to Lumina's character arc in the story, and a lot of Nova's psychological profiling, is that Nova subconsciously knows, especially after his conversation with Neo at the end of Crossbeat, is that he's got to be a lot better at being a father. And, you know, maybe I guess he didn't get the memo that the whole, you know, an important role of a father is to believe in his daughter, and to be a comfort to his daughter, which Neo did not get from him. And so, since Lumina can't just be like, "Hey, buddy," to Neo, like, it won't work. So throughout, even like, there was some stuff earlier, but you see it a lot more post Crossbeat, that Lumina starts developing this kind of parent-child relationship with other characters. The obvious one is Michiru. There's a huge parent-child relationship between them. If you look at my the D4DJ and Father Figures 3 video, and I did that ending montage. The reason why I made that montage was to kind of show moments, because I was too lazy to go like every single moment that Lumina kind of acts like a father figure, and I just let it play as like a montage and let the scene speak for itself. But Lumina has moments that she's kind of like a father figure to other characters. So in the New Year's story, and of course Crossbeat, Lumina is a father figure to Michiru. And that kind of comes up again in the Gigacat story. Once again, Lumina is being like is more of a father figure to Michiru. And that's probably the character that she acts the most quote-unquote fatherly to. One of the things that really made me like Uni Coke a lot, and I had to like, this is why I made D4DJ and Father Figures 3 in the first place, was because when I was doing research for the Hayate video, and going through Uni Coke a lot, I was like, man, this moment with Lumina and Hayate is so poignant. But I couldn't use that to like, I didn't want to just focus on Lumina during the Hayate essay. And just talk about like, okay, what is she being told? Not how awesome Lumina is being in that scene, but what is Lumina effectively telling Hayate, and the whole like, be proactive in your relationship. In that moment, in that long dialogue between Lumina and Hayate, it's a great, like, Lumina gets to be Hayate's father figure, and it's a very interesting one because Hayate is the one who's most what's the word I'm thinking of? not disgruntled, but she's like, Hayate moved out of her parents' house because she couldn't be around her parents. And so, even though, like, okay, Michiru, you don't see her dad, but he's apparently around. And Kokowa, her dad is around, but you just don't see them interact much. But Hayate doesn't interact with her dad. But what's interesting is that Lumina really fills that void in Hayate's life. And I think that's why, like, Unikokolot, you see it a lot more with Lumina. That Lumina is a father figure in that story. And of course, there's the whole, like, I mean, she is technically replacing Ryujin as, like, the quote-unquote barista master or whatever. And that's, like, Lumina's becomes, like, a father figure a lot more in that story. And I think that's why, like, Unikokolot is a very interesting story that way. And especially with Hayate, because Hayate acts like, oh, she don't, you know, she's very, like, almost apathetic to, like, needing a father figure in her life, because she, like, moved out of her home so she could be away from her parents. But then Lumina fills that void of that missing father figure in her life. And I think that story is, it's very poignant for that reason. I think that's one of the moments where you really start seeing Lumina be a father figure. And then, of course, you go to the Halloween story, which took place before Unikokolot. Once again, Michiru is the character that Lumina starts acting like a father figure to. And then even, like, that extends to Sophia quite a bit, which I think is actually very interesting. Sophia kind of ends up being adopted, quote unquote, by Nova, because we also learned through Side Nova that Sophia had a very rough life, and that's because, like, all the Abyssmere girls have, like, very bad relationship with their parents, but Sophia's is, like, a special case of bad, that it led her to feel suicidal, that even, like, she felt like even her parents didn't love her. And so Lumina fills that void for Sophia. And I think, honestly, like, I that was a missed opportunity in the father figures video. But I mean, that video was already, like, pretty long as it was. The montage was pretty long. But if you look at the Crossroads of Abyssmere and the conversation with Lumina and Sophia, once again, it's a very powerful scene, and you see a lot of Lumina being Sophia's father figure. So it extends to people outside of Unicorn. And of course, the New Year's story has a little bit of, well, it has both Michiru and Kokowa. Lumina gets to be a father figure to them. And then even, like, once again, Lumina starts acting like a father figure even before Crossbeat, as you see in the Summer Chord, the Summer story, and the one where, even though Lumina mostly figured out at that point that, like, Kokowa and Hayate were in a romantic relationship, the fact that they trust her enough, like, Hayate especially trusts Lumina enough to just tell her, it shows that, like, oh yeah, you know, in that scene, Lumina acts like an adult figure, a more parental and child figure. And then finally, there's actually a very interesting dynamic that happens kind of to the side, and the audience is privy to this, but the characters don't see it very often. But Lumina and Pumina's relationship is actually more of a father-daughter one, as opposed to two sisters. Even though, yes, Michiru points out in Crossbeat that they are sisters, when you watch them interact, especially in the Lumina member card in Unikokolot, and the Lumina member card in Ifcord, and it's just like Lumina and Pumina just kind of playing around with each other, and it's very, like, parent-child as opposed to two sisters. And so Lumina as well, even though once again there's like some before Crossbeat, but especially since Crossbeat, you see that Lumina starts, I don't know, this sounds weird to say it this way, but like practices being a father. And yeah, it sounds terrible that he kind of uses Unicorn as like his training dummies on how to be a better father. But that's because that's ultimately what Lumina wants. And that's where we kind of see like the growth of Lumina being the hero of Side Nova and Crossbeat, and moving forward, Nova being a more heroic character in that he strives to be a good father. Even though, once again, it's also a very steep uphill battle, because fixing all the years of damage he did to his daughter is not something that's going to be resolved easily. And some people may say not at all, but at the same time, an important theme of Crossbeat is that there's hope that Neo can come around. Now we're moving to the present. There and back again. Recontextualizing if chord with all of that in mind. And this is where, like, this is the stuff I skipped over in D4DJ and Father Figures 3. Because once again, that video was more about me just proving he is, like, Lumina is Nova. But now we're going to look at, like, his mentality in that story. Because I think as I mentioned when we were talking about the 5 stages of grief, If Chord is the story where he finally comes to acceptance in his in their stages of grief. Now, the giant plot hole that's made is Lumina being completely wrong about her time travel theory. If you guys remember, okay. No, I was just looking at my notes there for a second. There's a giant plot hole in If Chord, if you guys remember. After she restores the data logs of Michiru, Kokoa, and Hayate, she's like, why can't I return to the real world? I thought I fixed everything. And then Lumina goes, okay, hang on, I gotta fix my own data log. And then she comes up with this theory of like, okay, I gotta somehow quote unquote travel back in time in my memories and find the moment I was created. And then she's like, okay, I'm gonna go to the forest, the American wilderness where I was created, quote unquote. But then Lumina ends up being completely wrong. Because when Pumina does the whole like sends her back in time, she does not end up in the American wilderness. She ends up in a weird blue digital space. And so the question is that a plot hole that Lumina ends up being completely wrong? But of course, with everything I've already said up to this point, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Is she wrong? Or maybe we were misled on wrong assumptions. And that wrong assumption I'm going to point out is Unicorn Lumina probably still believed that she was Lumina too. But this is where you run into like how much of Lumina 4 is actually her own person. Because if she was, she would be aware of Lumina 2 no longer being part of who she is. Because that's, you know, Proto-Lumina sucked up Lumina 2 back in Crossbeat. So why would Lumina be wrong? Shouldn't she be aware of that? Is Lumina 4 really like that oblivious to the other Luminas? I don't know. It's not. Once again, this is like, there are plot holes in that, but maybe, and I know this sounds like kind of like creepypasta levels, but Nova perhaps does not let her know. Because this is where you kind of blur the lines of like, okay, maybe Lumina 4 doesn't know because there is really no Lumina 4. It's just Nova just being in denial again. And Lumina 4 is just his mask. So Lumina's 3 and 4 are actually the same Lumina. But once again, there's actually that can't be the case because there's a contradiction at the end of the story. At the end of Fifth Chord. That they have to be two separate personalities. So back in D4DJ and Father Figures 3, I talk about how Lumina ends up going to, or her memories reorient themselves, and she ends up in a place in like some American Midwest town, and she has very little knowledge of it. And Lumina even mentions, I think back in the Call of Artemis story, the Voice of a Goddess Sing for You, where she points out that there's supposedly very little information on Arya's hometown, even on the internet, which is crazy to think about, because if you remember throughout Side Nova, Lumina is so powerful, like any little information on the internet she can retrieve, because in Side Nova 2 there's the whole thing with like Kokoa and Kogetsu, and Lumina was able to dig up like deleted diggities, and so Lumina's immensely powerful. And so for her to be like in If Chord, oh, you know, I have so little information about this place, we have to assume that like not much is known about this place. And so the AI cannot draw a lot of information, but yet Lumina starts talking about how like, oh, you know, this place is, why do I feel like I know this place? And that's where, once again, I'm pretty sure we were misled. We, the audience, were misled, because it's not until it's easy to see this in hindsight, but as you build up the story, it is not until we get the Arya and Lumina conversation that we really see like, okay, the writers tip their hand, and that's the moment you're supposed to know that Nova is a Lumina. Like, yes, they sprinkled it throughout the entirety of Lumina's story, but If Chord is the moment they tip their hand. Anything I need to address from here? Probably not really. Let's see what we know about Lumina's psychological profile. Oh yeah, so I want to talk about the scene itself now that we have all the pretext to it. Now, you remember back in D4DJ and Father Figures 3, I talked about how Lumina figures that she was transported to where Arya grew up. She kind of figures that out based on her surroundings. And she hears some singing from the chapel. She enters and sees none other than Arya. Now, there's something that needs to be addressed, because this fake Arya is more. It's similar to the other Unicorn members in If Chord, the fake versions, as I refer to them as in Father Figures 3. And that's where they're reconstructed versions made on some kind of like something going wrong in their history. So for example, in Michiru's case, the alternate Michiru, the fake Michiru, was a version Lumina imagined where Michiru gave up on DJing altogether. And so this is also true of the fake Arya. The fake Arya he encounters is an Arya recreated from something must have changed according to his memory. And so the reason why that's the case, I pointed out that like, okay, so when Lumina proposes the theory of traveling back in time to the American wilderness to find Nova and the creation of Lumina 2, that is supposed to be 4 years before the present day. But Arya is dead for 8 years. So 4 years would be like 4 years after she died. I mean, you can think of timelines and weird things like that. So, but despite this, in the fake Lumina's memories, there's a version of Arya that's alive. And so, based on what we know of Nova, and I've been like basically at this point, like now here comes the big giveaway. But based on what we know about Lumina's psychological profile, what were the prerequisites for Lumina to imagine a world for Arya to be alive? Now, I did kind of get at this. I did get at this in D4DJ and Father Figures 3. But once again, as I've stated several times already today, I was too busy giving evidence for Nova being Lumina that I didn't psychologically profile him. But I had a whole paragraph where I go into like, okay, what is the kind of world Lumina would need to imagine for Arya to be alive? And what I'm pretty sure is the case, and this is why the scene itself is as poignant as it is that Lumina imagines a world where Nova never came back for Arya. And this, if that's the case, it speaks volumes to his sense of guilt. As perhaps Nova imagined a world that him and Arya never ended up together. And that is a world where she lives. And so the inverse logic is he believes, and this is where we get into the dark creepypasta moments, but Nova believes, and this is where I tried to justify like Nova having PTSD, is because he's so riddled with guilt because he believes he killed Arya via a cosmic domino effect. So in Father Figures 3, I gave you this paragraph, and I'm gonna quote myself now. So walk with me for a bit. Imagine a world where Arya never became ill. Lumina describes her appearance as looking young, suggesting that she's in good health. Because once again, the whole 4-year time travel thing. It's an older Arya, but she looks younger, which is weird to think of. Like, that doesn't make sense normally. But once again, in a world where she didn't have to... Imagine where Arya stayed in this chapel. She didn't go out and start making, huge banger albums and became stressed through a world tour, which she died during in the main timeline. But never knowing the wonderful feeling of having her own song resonate across a global audience. Imagine a world where she never moved to New York. She never would have been scouted out by Mitsuhashi's show, a perfectionist who worked her to the bone. Imagine a world where a reason for leaving the simple life never walked through those church doors. A simple girl who loved singing but never went beyond the provincial town. Arya sits alone in this church as if she was waiting for something or someone to walk through those doors. And so it's interesting of what is Nova really imagining? On the one hand, he imagines that life would be better for her if he never came back. But at the same time, the way he perceives Arya would have been so depressed if that never happened. So Nova's logic is basically that he thinks if he never came back for Arya, then none of those things would have happened. If he didn't go back to New York and marry her, if he didn't come back from New York and married her, then none of the other stuff would have happened. Arya would have lived a peaceful life. But this raises the question, how much of it is really his fault? Now, if you accept the cosmological domino effect, you could argue that the fact they even knew each other led to her death, which is just like a silly extreme. So, I mean, we could argue, we could debate this for hours, but the question is is it his fault that she died? And think of like the ramifications of how much guilt we want to put on him. But regardless of how much we could debate of how much it is his fault, what's important to the story is that Nova believes it's his fault. And that is why everything else happened throughout Lumina's story. Nova, he always believed it was his fault. And so that's why he feels so guilty going back to side Nova 9 or Supernova. Why he felt so guilty of abandoning Neo. He came to realize that like he was so caught up in this past guilt that he failed to care for what was in front of him the whole time, his own daughter. And so his guilt of something that he had no control over, because he felt so much guilt over something he had little to no control over, it destroyed what he did have, and it ruined it made him destructive where he did have control, if that makes sense. Which is why, like, once again, the whole like why he's such a bad father, and why a lot of people may feel that, oh, you know, Nova is almost unforgivable for what he did to Neo, because that was something he could have controlled. He had full control over that. But because of his he himself has a warped imagination of the causes of Arya's death, that it warped everything else of how he perceived the world. And that's where I would make the argument that he must have PTSD, because he does border into insanity. That he doesn't perceive and when I say like he's falling into insanity, is he actually has a distorted view of reality itself. He blames himself for something that he had little to no control over, but then fails to take responsibility until basically his moment of death, to realize that he screwed up somewhere that he did have control. And so that is where, you know, Nova is the ghost facing guilt. Him confronting the Arya memory and the fake Arya is him facing his guilt. Because he wants to believe in a world that could be better without him in it. And that better world is where Arya is alive, because that's how much he worships her, basically. That anything, and this goes back to the whole bargaining in the stages of grief, anything for her to be alive, even if he didn't exist anymore in this hypothetical. Even if he wasn't around anymore, at least Arya would still be alive, and that's what matters. But the problem and the scary thing about facing guilt is that, yes, you see the guilt, and the guilt sees you. And that is what Nova has to confront that. And I think the scene with Lumina and Arya it's him basically saying, I'm not running away anymore. I can't run away anymore. I've been running away for so long. Over 8 years. Between, you know, his life as Nova and then his new life as Lumina. And the entire time he's been running. But imagining a world with Arya in it, he can't run from his sense of shame anymore, his sense of guilt. And so the question is, how does he deal with it? But we need to look at a few things before we actually look at the scene itself. So there's a build-up in Ifcord, and what makes Ifcord kind of a fun story, a very interesting story, is that everything else built up for him to face his guilt. And so the story begins with lightning come back with a vengeance. And once it's like a weird doofy moment where, like, okay, the lightning hits and then the building's power goes out and only Lumina goes out of commission. Apparently Lumina is perfectly fine. But Lumina goes into Lumina's subconscious again. So Lumina's 2 and 3 are reunited in consciousness, if you will. So what's interesting about Ifcord is that Ifcord kind of goes backwards from what we saw in Nova's timeline, if you will, inside Nova. From him dying, and then of course Lumina's character arc inside Nova. And you kind of go backwards. So Side Nova ended with the memory of the lightning bolt. Ifcord begins with the lightning bolt. And so basically Nova is back where he started. A fateful encounter where he is given a new life and a chance to start over. But now that he's living through that, like, starting over, the question now becomes, is he going to hide behind a mask again? Like he did the first time he was isekai'd? Or is he going to stand up and fight? What makes Ifcord an interesting build-up to him facing his guilt is that there's a thematic parallel between Arya and all the Unicorn members. And I think that's why you go through all these moments of Lumina trying to fix the data logs of the fake Unicorn members. And I think that there's an interesting theme that's played with Lumina interacting with the fake Unicorn members before going to meet Arya. The fake Arya, if you will. So, fake Michiru is a version of Michiru that gave up on DJing. Now, if you remember inside Nova 6, excuse me, my throat's getting a bit dry. Inside Nova 6, Unison, it begins with Michiru's flashback. And why we're basically given the explanation of why Michiru is, like, so gung-ho on creating a unit. And it's because she's afraid of being alone. It's kind of what we learn about Michiru. Because the problems that Michiru has is that she's, like, too passionate about DJing, but people can't keep up with her because Michiru is just like, Michiru goes from 0 to 60 real fast. Let's just put it that way. And people just couldn't handle her. So Michiru ended up being abandoned by, like, her middle school friends. I think it's middle school. She's abandoned by them, and she falls into depression, basically. And then she's actually comforted by her uncle, Haruki. But to assume a world where Michiru gave up on DJing, I'm going to just assume that didn't happen. Because if you remember, if you parallel it with Side Nova 6, he's a huge inspiration for why Michiru kept going, even though Michiru wanted to give up. But fake Michiru doesn't have that. Then we get fake Hayate, or false Hayate. In the slides I called her false Hayate, so I should be consistent. Hayate becomes an idol in spite of her dad's protest. So in Side Nova Leader, or Part 5, it begins with Hayate's backstory. And as I mentioned before, Hayate ended up moving out of her parents' house because she couldn't handle the pressure from her parents. And one of them was her dad was like, no, you gotta study hard, be academically rigorous, get a good education, get a real job, you know, that kind of thing. And Hayate's dad was, like, super gung-ho on that. While her mom was more like, oh no, Hayate should explore the arts. After all, she's like good looking, she's got a good voice. You know, maybe she should explore the arts. And so for a world for Hayate to become an idol would be to go so far in that direction. And just basically be like totally spite her dad and all of his protests. So in like Rio Hayate, she couldn't decide between her parents, and that's why she moved out, because her grandfather gave her an out. But in a world where Hayate becomes an idol, you kind of see that she clearly leaned one way over the other. And you could guess that there's like a sense of embitterment in Hayate. Then we get to Kokoa, and I don't know why my notes is misspelled here, but false Kokoa she's basically like a total shut-in, and her relationship with her father is so bad, and Kokoa not going out and anything like that. There's a moment where the Unicorn members, after Lumina restores Michiru and Hayate, they go to a false Kokoa's house, and they find that the door is unlocked. And they just kind of casually just walk in. And it's a world where Kokoa's relationship with her father deteriorated so much that he probably didn't even care if she got abducted. That's why the door is probably unlocked, which is super dark to think about. This is a huge contrast to, like, yes, Kokoa's father was not the best father. As I mentioned in The Lonely Moon, there's the whole thing about how Kokoa's father is supposed to be like the chief comforter in Kokoa's life after her mother died. And there's an interesting parallel between Neo and Kokoa. But the difference is that Nova straight up becomes abusive. Whereas Kokoa's father is not as abusive. He's more negligent, but there are other stories where a negligent parent can be just as, if not more, destructive than even an abusive one, which is really morbid to think about. And D4DJ has an example of that. A parent who's more neglectful and did more damage. Yeah, a parent who's neglectful did more damage than Nova did. And Nova was an abusive father. So, like that, like, it's hard to say, like, okay, what's worse, right? A neglectful parent or an abusive one? Because they're both horrible for different reasons. And they can both cause, like, severe psychological damage to their children. But in Kokoa's case, false Kokoa, yeah, she's like, her relationship with her father deteriorated so much that basically they don't talk. She yells through the door at him. Well, at Unicorn, thinking it's him. But all of these false Unicorn members and their altered versions, they share a common theme with the fake Arya. And that is the idea that the father figures in their lives never came back for them. Hayate is a little bit more ambiguous about him coming back for her, but that's definitely a theme for Lumina. Because Lumina as Nova is the mask to run away from that fact that Nova abandoned his daughter and did not come back for her. But getting a second chance at life as Lumina allowed him to try and come back for her. And of course, what I think would happen in future stories, they keep developing Neo and Lumina's relationship, is Lumina revealing that, like, your father did come back for you. That's me, basically. And that goes to the alternate Arya. The Arya was an Arya who was alone because Nova never came back. And so when Lumina is restoring the memories of the quote-unquote, or fixing her data logs by restoring the false Unicorn members, is they all share the theme of him as their father figure coming back for them. And I think it really shows where his guilt really lies. His sense of Nova's sense of guilt really lies. It really lies in the fact that he never came back for his daughter. Because that was, once again, that was something he could control. And just chose not to. He chose not to come back for her. And that's why he's so ashamed of himself. And so, in the If Court story, he's kind of like exercising that in his head. And it's interesting that is what it takes for him to fix for Nova to fix the data logs. For Lumina to fix the data logs within her subconscious, is she has to come back for them. And she came back for all of Unicorn. Even if it wasn't really them. She would not abandon them. And I think there's an interesting parallel there, because I think what it's meant to show is that that's how much Nova's worldview has changed. That he's not gonna run away from his problems, pretend to be someone else to run away from his problems, but instead, he's going to face them head on. And so, when going back to that moment before Lumina goes back in time, when Lumina's coming up with her plan to time travel to fix her own data log, that is what allows her to have that confrontation. Is that Lumina's like thinking, Lumina thinks, I'm gonna face this head on. I'm not gonna run away anymore. And by not running away anymore, Nova becomes a ghost freed of guilt. The Lumina and Arya encounter has Nova go back and forth between the performative Unicorn Lumina and the serious Nova Lumina. Now, maybe I'll show this scene again, because once again, it's actually an important detail that I didn't talk about in D4DJ and Father Figures 2. Or sorry, D4DJ and Father Figures 3. But there's actually an important detail that I also thought about of like good evidence, but I ended up not using it, because the reason why I didn't use it was because it would have broken the flow of the essay. But there's actually an interesting concept that occurs, and it's kind of meta, which is why I didn't talk about it, because like it would have been kind of weird to bring up like a very meta reason for why I thought Nova was a Lumina. And that is because in If Chord, I assumed something called I operated with something called the cardinal rule of animation. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, the cardinal rule of animation is the idea that if something is animated, you assume it to be intentional. And so, in If Chord, we'll play the scene, because I think it's a good scene. Alright, just give me a sec here. I'm going to turn this off for a sec. I'm going to mute it for a sec. And I'm going to play a scene for you. If I can find it here. Just give me a minute. Alright. Operating with 10 windows at once. Don't know what I'm doing. Okay. I think it's this one. Okay, so we're gonna play this scene again in If Chord. And I want you to pay attention to the animation. And you'll kind of see this argument I've made about Nova and Lumina and Unicorn Lumina being two different people in this scene. which was a big point I did make in Revenge of the Nova. But I left out this detail because I felt like this detail was very meta and would have broken the flow of the essay.
どうして僕はここを知っているんだろう。
Just gonna move my
こ
mouse
の
out of the
景
way.
色を直接見たことがあるわけではない。でも単に人類の蓄積データの一辺を映像化しているわけでもない。これは確かに僕の記憶の中にあるものだ。
I went too far back.
つまり、そうか。こ
And
れは
hopefully, YouTube
僕の
won't be a
中に
jerk
ある
and play an
ア
ad.
リアの魂が持つ記憶だ。ということは、ここは以前、アイリが話してくれた、アリアの故郷。歌姫になる前、まだ何者でもない、ただ歌が好きな女の子だった。彼女が過ごした。この歌声、もしかして、
Oh no, it did
Never
happen.
dreamed of
I knew it was
feeling
gonna
like you're
happen.
on
I
your
should have known it was gonna happen. Every time it tries to go to the next chapter, it'll play an ad. Just give me a sec here. Real professional level stream here, guys. Okay. I can turn it back on now. Pay attention to this scene.
映像で見たアリアよりも若い。本当にネオそっくりだな。いや、これはあくまでも記憶データをビジュアル化したもの。本物のアリアの姿ではないのかもしれないな。それでも、この歌声は本物だと思えてならない。胸が高鳴る。これがアリアの歌声か。たまたま通りかかったものさ。歌声に連れられてきたんだ。いや、こっちこそ。君は歌が好きなのかい？そうか。そうだろうな。あ、もちろん。僕は宇宙一楽しい音楽を目指す真っ最中だからさ。ああ、君ならできるよ。いや、こっちこそ邪魔して悪かったね。どうしたんだい？ああ、僕もそう思うよ。うん、またいつか。ありがとう、アリア。僕の大切な記憶でいてくれて。
Okay. Before you guys get epilepsy by flashing lights of Lumina. Let me get rid of that because I don't need it now. Let me turn this thing back on. Turn that back on. Okay. So, if you guys caught it, there were moments where Lumina would move on the frame. So sometimes she would be on the right side of a frame. And then there would be times where Lumina's in the center of the frame. And Lumina would move back and forth between them. And if you look at the dialogue that's said when Lumina is in certain positions, what the story is hinting at, and this is what really inspired the whole like D4DJ Father Figures 3 video, is that what the story is really hinting at is that there are two Luminas in this scene talking to Arya. And when Lumina is being more unicorn Lumina, you know, the whole like music of like making the best music in the universe, and being very formal. That Lumina is always on the right side of the screen. Whereas when Lumina is a lot more somber and drops a lot of that kind of fake preppiness, then Lumina's in the center of the frame. And what's interesting when you look at that scene is that when Lumina's in the center of the frame, the lines are very like, there's even a moment where like Lumina's flirting with Arya. And that's kind of the tipping point where like, okay, that's who Lumina actually is. And I mean, who else could it be at that point? It's kind of the logical conclusion I'm trying to lead you guys to, is that, well, it's obviously Nova. That's who Lumina really is. And when you see those moments where the mask kind of drops again with Lumina. So even in the interaction with Arya, Nova is still trying to maintain that mask, the fake Lumina. But when confronted with his feelings, and especially like he starts reliving his enamored feelings, which is why he flirts with her with that one line. Even Arya's taken aback. She's like, oh. But Nova, by reliving his enamored feelings, it gives him the strength to accept the love he has for her. And that love is stronger than his sense of guilt. And I think that's what the scene is really supposed to help him with. And that's why at the end of the exchange, Lumina says, "Thank you for being a precious memory." Because that's where you get like, I made this case in Revenge of the Nova. And it's funny, I always refer to different parts of the title as I keep referencing it. But in Revenge of the Nova, Lumina's lines constantly contradict themselves in that scene. And the simplest explanation, with help of the cardinal rule of animation, is that there are two different Luminas. And the two different Luminas have their own independent thoughts. And the Nova Lumina, his thoughts are all about that nostalgia, his feelings. Everything feels right to him. Whereas Lumina's constantly like, this doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Why is this way? I don't know any of this that's going on right now. Because this is not in my data log. But for Nova, everything's all about his feelings. And for him to embrace those feelings is what ends up restoring the Lumina memory. And of course, I pointed out in that video that there's like an apparent plot hole of Lumina not actually coming in contact with Arya to fix her data. And so you're like, well, then how did she end up fixing herself? And I proposed the idea that, well, Nova kind of came in contact with his heart after so long. And what makes Ifcord such an interesting story is that for the longest time, even though Ifcord comes back to Side Nova and it replays it because Nova had to go through it again because, you know, Lightning Kun made him forget the first time, but not the second time. That he needed to accept who he is and not run away. But he had run away for so long, and that's why. How do I put this? He's been running away for so long that he almost lost himself, and he continuously failed to do what he should have been doing. And so the way he restores himself is that he comes in contact with his heart. Now back in Side Nova 9 or Supernova, he tries to reprogram Lumina 2 to have to teach Neo to have a heart. But Neo can't do that because the person she needs is her father. And he's been running away for so long that he did not have his heart. He stayed broken. He never bothered to fix his heart. But him confronting his feelings with the fake Arya, his memory of her, him rebuilding his memory of her, is him finding his own heart, because he's gonna need his heart to try and mend his daughter's broken heart, because at the end of the day, only he can fix what he damaged. As much as Neo, like, as great as the rest of Abyssmere are, as great as Neo's other relationships are with Kyoko and, well, Abyssmere and other characters, the only person who can really repair Neo's heart is her father. But at the same time, he didn't even do that himself all these years. He had been running away for so long, he never bothered to do that himself. But what makes Ifcourt so interesting, and this great character resolution for Lumina, is that Nova finally rebuilt his heart. And so now he's almost ready. You know, he's had the last couple years of groovy mix time to develop his skills as a father, but even developing the skill is not enough, because the thing about Nova, he's supposed to be like a smart guy, but with that said, it's not his IQ that was ever the problem. It was always his heart, and that he kept it broken for so long, and that was why he failed to reconcile with Neo in Crossbeat. Is because he failed to repair his heart. His oldest daughter, his oldest daughter, Proto-Lumina, her problem can be solved intellectually, and that's how he's able to reconcile with her. But with Neo, the damage is not an intellectual one; it's an emotional one, and so he had to repair his emotions in order to try and repair his relationship with his daughter. And what's really interesting is that when Lumina wakes up back into the real world, it's very interesting, because what happens is they start talking, and then Lumina mid-conversation begins crying, and Coco is the one who points it out, which is a nice callback, once again paralleling Side Nova. Cocoa was the one who called out Nova for having no heart. Or Lumina. She called out Lumina for having no heart. You don't have a heart. And yeah, they talk about how like Lumina kind of has a heart, but they only got to see a little bit of it. And Lumina never really allowed herself to share her heart with them. Yes, they could see her heart, but she never shared it with them. Then you go to Ifcourt, and in Ifcourt, Lumina cries in front of them for the first time. Which is crazy to think, because, you know, you have moments in like Crossbeat where Hayate says, Lumina, you're the most human person I've ever met. But at the same time, you have moments like this where like, Lumina has never, you actually look at, when you look through like Side Nova and Crossbeat, Lumina's never cried in front of them. She's never actually let herself be emotionally vulnerable with them. And these are supposedly her closest friends. But that's because for so long, Nova was so scared. He was afraid. That's why he always ran away from his problems. That's why he adopted a fake identity as Lumina. He always ran away. But we get the scene where Lumina wakes up and she cries in front of them for the first time. And that scene is poignant because it shows that he's not afraid anymore. He can be himself. Something that he wants to try and teach Neo, but how could he possibly teach his daughter to do something he can't do himself? But for the first time, he cries in front of them. And he's unashamed of it, which is the huge shift, because throughout Lumina's character arc, Nova is full of nothing but shame. He's full of shame, he's full of guilt through the entire story. And then we finally get to this moment in If Chord, and Lumina is no longer ashamed. And part of it is because, of course, he reawakens his love for his wife, and that allows him to kind of, how do I put it? It allows him to love again. Because it's easy to try and tell someone you should show more love. But Nova suppressed his own emotions, that he forgot what that was like. But now that he remembers, he is unashamed of that. And that's where, once again, him being the father figure to the other unicorn girls, once again, he's able to do that on an intellectual level. But the moment of him crying in front of them is, it's him overcoming his sense of guilt. And because he's now that through love he's found the strength to overcome guilt, he is free of it. And because he wants to be, and now that he's free from his guilt, he's more prepared to face his daughter. Because he became depressed when Neo first said, you know what, I could never forgive the old bastard. But now he's like, you know what, I'm not ashamed of that. I still love you anyway. And that's something that maybe when Neo hears those words from him, that will change her mind. And as I explained in D4DJ and Father Figures 3, a big part of Neo's character arc is that eventually she has to reconcile with him. If she's ever going to pursue her goal of this new Abyss Mare, which is really just more words to say she's going to succeed her mother like she's meant to, a big part of that journey is Neo reconciling with her father. So now that Nova, as Lumina, has gone through this whole character arc of overcoming his sense of guilt through love, now he's able to share that love with his daughter. And perhaps that is through love, Neo will acquire the strength to overcome her sense of shame, her traumas. Because, as Martin Luther King said, hate cannot drive out hate. Fear cannot drive out fear. Violence does not drive out violence. Only love can do those things. And so, with Nova finding love in himself and accepting himself through that, his ability to love Neo is what's going to help her overcome her trauma. Because love is the power that does that. No, yes, therapy is obviously important, but intellectual discourse is not enough to overcome trauma, to overcome the stages of guilt, the stages of grief, in our lives. Only love can do that. And so Nova's arc of realizing his love for his wife and by extension his daughter, that is what will empower Lumina moving forward, to be braver with Neo. And there are some moments where Lumina wanted to do that, but Lumina constantly struggled, because only through acceptance can Lumina... Only through acceptance is Lumina prepared to show Neo the love she needs from him. So, what's next for the Nova saga? Well, the big one is the mask of Lumina needs to come off completely. And that's so Nova and Neo can finally settle their differences. Because, yes, on an intellectual level, Neo thinks she's freed from that. She even states it in Crossbeat. On an intellectual level, she likes to believe that. But she's still emotionally charged. That's why she's like, on the one hand, I can let go of my father. But at the same time, I can't forgive the guy. It's like, well, which one is it? And it's because what Neo needs is not an intellectual thing. What she needs is an emotional thing. Which was something that I covered all the way back in D4DJ and Father Figures 2. You know, the whole why Neo struggles as much as she does, even to this day. Why she struggles to this day is because, once again, Neo doesn't need drill sergeants telling her how to do things. Neo knows how to do things. What Neo needs is love, ultimately. And yes, Abyssmare covers a lot of that for her. But there's still that part of her that she needs to know from her father that he loves her. And yeah, Lumina said that on an intellectual level at the end of Crossbeat. You know, yes, you had a father who always loved you. But there's a difference between someone saying, yes, your father loved you, versus it could be one thing for me, like for me to tell you, some guy on the internet to tell you, yeah, your dad loves you. It's another thing for your father to hug you and say, I love you, sweetie. That's what Neo needs. And now that Lumina has faced that in herself, perhaps she's ready to do that for Neo. If Chord, I feel like, see, the thing about the reverse stories, and the reason why I'm so gung-ho on this idea, is because it's not just If Chord that pushes this idea for Neo to reconcile with her father. Crossroad of Abyssmare, which happened before If Chord, there's a huge thing about, like, Neo's trying to figure out what's next for Abyssmare, but she doesn't know. And a good reason why she doesn't know is because she lacks that affirmation. And that affirmation probably comes from her father. Because Neo still needs that. That's why she's so confused still, because she's like, something is missing in my life. And that's the love of her father. And then you get to Neo still feels she needs the mask of like the cool, collected Psy Nova version Neo, as she confesses to Kyoko in the Peaky Peaky reverse story. Because Neo is still scared to be vulnerable. But that's because she never received that from her father. And what makes If Chord so interesting is that now that Nova is no longer held down by his sense of guilt for effectively killing his wife. I feel as if like he's more or less ready now to face his daughter. How Neo will handle it is a whole different can of worms. But as far as Nova's concerned, because he's come in contact with his heart, he can now do what he wanted Lumina to do. And so now Lumina is still the mask of is still his mask to hide his trauma, but at the same time, Lumina was always meant to be the vehicle for him to do what he always wanted to do, to teach his daughter to have a heart. And now that he's reconnected to his, he can do that himself. And he's ready to face his guilt of abandoning Neo and all the damage he caused her. Other like story beats would be Lumina revealing the truth to Unicorn. Eventually Unicorn's gotta find out. At the same time, there's like the elephant in the room is like, oh no, wait, like I think a big reason why we don't want and myself included, to some extent, we don't want Nova to actually be a Lumina. I think it's because, like, I'm gonna... you can't say this without, like, shit-talking. But we gotta do some shit-talking. It's like, Japanese writers, why you guys gotta do this? There's, like, I feel like there's, like, because it's not just D4... Like, D4DJ is just one of many. But there's a lot of... And a lot of people forget that D4DJ is actually a seinen. As in, like, a for men kind of anime story. And seinens like to have their, like... They like to throw in that relationship. You guys know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that elephant in the room. But, I feel like that wouldn't go... It's worse in this case, because... Michiru doesn't know. And so... Yeah. There's no nice way of going about this. But, perhaps Lumina will reveal the truth to Unicorn of her Nova persona. That's who Lumina really is. Now, on the one hand, like, once again, like, in the slides I put, like, all the positives. Where it's... Yeah, Lumina's trusted Unicorn this far. So, Lumina could easily trust them with that information. They're like, oh, this is who I really am. Now that he's come to accept who he is. And of course that would also give some, like, consolation to the Unicorn members. Like, oh, that would explain why you act like... Why you're like a dad to us sometimes. That would explain a few things. And of course, like, if they don't want to just go, like, straight into the Lumina confronting Neo, they could still build more, like, Lumina being a father figure to the Unicorn members, and even to, like, Sophia. We see a little bit of that in the Digaket story, where Lumina is very much Michiru's father figure. And Lumina's always, like, encouraging, chase your dreams kind of thing. You know, I believe in you. The very things that, you know, Nova should have been telling Neo growing up. Lumina does those things for Michiru. And, so there's, like, hints of that already happening. And so maybe some fun things that they would do. But, of course, I know people will be like, oh my god, more Lumina stories already. But, we would need more Lumina stories where, like, Lumina does it for Coco and Hayate and be like, I believe in you. You know, kind of things. And that's why, like, Michiru kind of... Because Michiru... See, it's so bad. It's so bad to say it this way. But we have to address the elephant in the room now, don't we? Because I've been beating around the bush about it. But on the one hand, like, it's that fatherly maturity. And, like, adult wisdom that makes Michiru kind of attracted to Lumina. But at the same time, underneath that cute anime girl avatar is a mean old man. And Michiru is kind of fallen for this guy. Now, of course, if they wanted to avoid, like, you know, the Drake kind of things going on, they could just have Lumina play it on and be like, look, I already have someone in my life. Even though she's dead and I'm stuck in an immortal body, so we're never going to be reunited in the afterlife from the looks of it. But I have someone else. You know, like, Lumina could let her down easy, but I doubt they would do that because, I mean, these are seinen writers we're dealing with, and they gotta... I feel like someone in that writing team feels they need to fill that quota. Which is just like, oof. Like, why? Why you guys gotta do that? But in Lumina's case, like, yeah, it's worse because Michiru does it unknowingly. And it's just like, oh, it makes me a little uncomfortable thinking about it. But there's still a lot of opportunities for Lumina to grow as their father figure. Anyway, that's basically all I have to say. So some close, I guess like... Nova's a very interesting character. I think he's a very interesting character in the way that how the writers somehow figured out to be like, okay, we have an all-girl music franchise, but we also like, because they're like, all the writers are a bunch of old guys, right? So they want to tell a very like traditional male hero's journey story, and the fact they somehow pulled that off with creating the character of Lumina is quite the feat. I think it's a very interesting thing about Lumina. And as I thought about this more, I was like, Lumina grew on me over the years, because I remember like first kind of not really liking Lumina. I was like, Lumina's like too perfect. But then the writers were like, gotcha. Now we're gonna show you that this is actually a whole like masculine hero's journey in an all-girls music franchise, which is a very bold move. But the fact they pulled it off, and looking at it in hindsight, it's like, you know what? Like, I was actually impressed that they pulled it off the way that they did. And it keeps you wanting to see how it will unfold, because they've already done so many, not really subversions. It's not like other isekai stories haven't done this, but to kind of do this like story of a father and his daughter through this kind of medium it's a very interesting thing to think about and to read. And over time, I've really come to like the Lumina story because of it. Even though at first I was like, yeah, whatever. But it's one of those things that happens. It's one of those funny things that happens as I do like these D4DJ essays, and I have to like study a character, and then you're like, you really look into it, you're like, wow, I actually find this really fascinating. And in the case of Lumina playing out this hero's journey, I think is very poignant. And I think it's a very important lesson to learn. And it's also one of those things that, like, you know, me being an old man, I guess now, like, I think about these things. So I think that's why the story also hits me a bit harder compared to other people. Because, you know, I don't want to screw things up with my daughter. Let's just put it that way. So there's the cautionary tale, but there's also the whole, like, never lose hope in that too. And always show love. And I think that's a great theme for understanding Lumina and the beauty of her character. And as I mentioned in Program Personhood, what makes it so phenomenally told is like, yes, even in the most inhuman of beings, you know, this ghost in the shell can show you what love is. And something to carry out in your life. That, yes, even though Lumina is an inhuman monster, basically. As a human, Nova was a monster. As an AI, Lumina is a monster. But even between them, there is still love. And that means anyone can love. And so even though this is really like our Halloween special, the thing I want to focus on is that, like, you know, the most important thing that you can have in your life is to love and be loved. That is one of the core aspects of the human experience. And I think the way they portray that with Lumina is a very thoughtful way of doing it. Anyway, that's all I have to say for this Lumina this D4DJ presentation. I'll leave the floor open for a couple minutes if you guys have questions or need clarity on certain things. Yeah, just put that in the chat real quick. We'll only hold this for a couple minutes. And then we'll end the stream soon. Because it's like already 10:30 for me, so it's kind of late. I guess we'll do some housekeeping. So, I know there was a lot of content for me this week. But that's because, like, I wanted to do this stream because I wanted to make up for the lack of D4DJ content on the channel. I know I had some technical difficulties with my editor. Basically, he needs to get a new computer. That's what it comes down to. His computer just broke down on him, so he was making my Yuka video, and then he had like a power outage, and supposedly it lost all his data, the video. So I kind of conceded to stop being so cheap and just buy my own editing program. Now I know some people would say, well, why don't you just get one of those free ones? But I'm too old man to figure out how to get around the watermark problems. Sorry, I'm old like that, okay? But I will just start making my own videos from now on. And I honestly, like, I should have been doing that from the beginning. It was just me being really cheap and not doing it myself. But hopefully, with that said, even though, like, yeah, I had a plan for the next video, I probably will, I'll probably take the, like, okay, tomorrow we're streaming again, because I'm going to do our regular scheduled Final Fantasy Tactics tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So after that, we'll start working on the next essay. I might as well let you guys know now. It's going to be Hero from Rondo. And then we'll be at the point, and I'm sure you guys caught this already, but I kind of rotate through the 8 main units. And the reason why it took me so long to get through the 3rd rotation was because I took so many side steps of, like, I ended up what? I finished the 2nd rotation with Maho. And then I made another Maho video immediately after that one. I did the Song of Space and Soil. And then after that, I did like a couple videos, and then I did a bad Cynic. No, after the Maho, I did a bad Cynic Doggo. So I actually didn't start the 3rd rotation until after that. And then I did a couple videos, and then I did a 2-parter with the Haruna video and then the Arasagawa Student Council, because I knew I had to make a video on that after that story ended. So I made that video, and then I did like a couple of and then like I did after I did the well, actually, oh man, 2025 just gets jumbled in my memories. But like, between the Haruna video and the Arasagawa Student Council, it was like Father's Day, so I had to make D4DJ Father Figures 3, which ended up being Lumina again. And then I did the Arasagawa one, and then I like continued on. And then like it took the whole year basically to finish this rotation, because like, okay, the Hero video won't be till like mid to late November. And then I don't know if I'm gonna do another D4DJ Christmas Advent this year. I don't have any interesting ideas for that this year, so if you guys have a suggestion, then you know, shoot in the comments or send me like a post or something, or you can even like DM me on Discord if you have ideas for a Christmas Advent for D4DJ. I don't know if I'm gonna do one though. That's a lot of work, and if I'm gonna start making my own videos as well, that like gets in the way of that too. So, but I'm hoping to like start the 4th rotation, like basically all the 4th members of all the units. And then we'll see if I'm still making these kind of videos. Because I know there's like, it's a lot of work to do these. And it's crazy to think I've been doing like D4DJ content for like 2.5 years. Almost 2 years of just the video essays. So we'll see what we do after. Like, you know, we let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We still gotta finish the 4th member of each unit, and then some. Because in between, like after we do the hero video, we have like an intermission video, if you will, kind of thing. Before we do all like the final group, and then after that, we might do other like D4DJ kind of video essays. Because like, for example, I made this joke with Saki. When I did the Saki video, I'm like, dude, Saki, you could have like four different like 4 different essays, video essays on just Saki. So, I don't know if that's true of every character, but some characters you could do like multiple. I mean, that was why I did like a Song of Space and Slow, because like, okay, the Maho and Saki dynamic, that warrants its own essay. And so, part of like, even like, okay, like Lumina in this case, like I just spent like 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours talking about Lumina. Because like, all Lumina's different dynamics with different characters. Each of them could warrant their own video essay. Like maybe I'll come back to the Sophia one, because I think there's a very interesting there's a very interesting discourse with just those two. So, but of course, like I have to make sure the Sophia video does not end up just being about that. So, we'll see what happens after I, you know, finish those videos. So that won't be for a while. So well into 2026 kind of thing. Oh my goodness, it's almost 2026. I feel like I've made this kind of joke already with the D4DJ videos. That's how fast time goes, and that's how, like, when you make D4DJ content like this long enough, it's just like all like blurs into each other. Oh, it's rough to think about, man. It's rough to think about. Anyway, so I will start on that hero essay after tomorrow's stream. Let's just say that. So, with that said, I know you got a lot of stuff from me this week. I had that Yuka video I released yesterday, so definitely check that out. And then tomorrow at 2 o'clock Pacific time, we are doing Final Fantasy Tactics, Ivalice Chronicles, continuing that game. I'm having a grand old time. I love that game. It's like one of my favorite games. But come hang out for that at 2 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow. And yeah, that's going to be it. I hope you guys enjoyed this special D4DJ presentation that also doubles as like the Streaming Parson podcast, which I haven't done in like forever. Because it's hard like between like the streams and the D4DJ essays, I kind of don't upkeep that series anymore. But anytime I do these kind of live stream talking videos, it's basically a podcast video. But anyway, this is going to be the end. Hope you guys enjoyed Ghost and D4DJ. Which I ended up not talking very much about Ghost, because I just assumed that like anytime I mention Nova, we're talking about a ghost. Because he's the ghost in the shell. And now that I've made that joke 3 times, I can't make that joke anymore. So, with that said, happy Halloween, which I know is not for another couple days, but happy Halloween. I hope you guys enjoyed this live stream, and I will see you guys tomorrow for Final Fantasy Tactics. Until then, I hope you guys have a good night, and God bless you.